This is a 90-minute, probably going to be a 90-minute live video, and this is a part two of another on Daniel 70 weeks. And I suggest you watch the first. I didn't know that the video was working. On my end, it doesn't look like it's working, but apparently it is. So I can't see what you guys see, but I don't need to. And this is an audio anyways. I mean, there's a video component, and if it helps understand, you watch the video, but this suffices as an audio because I'm not going to be showing any exhibits or anything like that. But where did we leave off in the video as a summary of the last video? It was like Nehemiah was where we were, and this has to do with the walls. So a lot of people think, oh, I know when this 70 weeks begins and ends, because if you go back from when Christ was executed 490 years, approximately 483 or whatever they do, and convert it, then they wind up in smack dab in the middle of the reign of Artaxerxes, and therefore Artaxerxes is the decree to go out and build a city, because of course that city, or it says the roads or maybe the walls, and in Daniel. So when it comes to when this time was that they did rebuild the temple, we kind of are able to narrow that down. It seems to be in the second year of Darius, but maybe later, but this was 100, let's say 70 years after Jeremiah's prophecy. So, Nebuchadnezzar's, the prophecy was, the verse before it's kind of talking about God's presence, and the verse after it's kind of talking about the king of Babylon, and the whole chapter is kind of about the king of Babylon. So it's really kind of about the destruction of Babylon. But when we see in Daniel 7:24, it's talking about the end of sin. But when we get into the context of Zechariah 1 that we went to, and Nehemiah chapter 1, it is a lot of this kind of repentance and things like that, and turning to God. So where did Ezra take us? It was kind of, well, before we get to Ezra, we kind of determined a few dates. Is the decree of Cyrus could have very well been 530 when he became king of Babylon, which would make sense for the end of the 7 years being the end of Babylon. So 530 is a really good date for either the beginning of the 70 weeks or after maybe 10 of the 70 weeks. Because Martin Luther, by the end of his career, is firmly that, the angel or Daniel would have to be a moron to not realize that the 490 begins at the time of the prophecy. But a lot of people, when they explain it to me, is, this 490 years goes way back to the time of Jeremiah, and Martin Luther calls this a big lie. And we may have time to get into what Martin Luther said, but what was I saying about there was that decree, and then we have another firm decree in Ezra. Both the Cyrus decree and the decree in Ezra by Darius seem to correspond with Zechariah, Chronicles, and different places in the Bible where this this is the narrative. And like I said, Nehemiah is not found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and what do we have is kind of a narrative that's different than the rest, because Ezra is a contemporary of Nehemiah. I think there's this point in Nehemiah where they almost talk about Caleb and Joshua in a way, like, or sorry, more like Zerubbabel and Joshua. You have this like two-part governing, both are anointed. You have like the anointed king who can't be the king because the Persian king is the king, so he's like the governor. And then you have, but he's as Martin Luther would say, like, Christ would be the scepter of the line of David, where that ends in him being Shiloh or something like this. And then on the other hand, you have the Levite Aaronic priesthood. I think even Ezra had said he was from the line of Aaron himself, I think. And I mean, we could go there right now while we're talking about it. Ezra, son of Sarai, then it goes down to Eleazar, son of the high priest Aaron. And also you have the prophets having Joshua and Zerubbabel, and this second year of Darius, there seems to be this other decree or word going out, like it says in Daniel 7:25. So it's like, is it Cyrus's decree? Like, let's say if you ignore Nehemiah for now, is it? And then you see the commission of Ezra given by Artaxerxes. So, but that is a little bit different because some might say that's the peopling of Jerusalem, but other people say Nehemiah would be the peopling. But even when there shows the people that came there before Ezra and Nehemiah, so neither one is a really clear answer. But it's not that Daniel 9 says peopling; it says the rebuilding, and the rebuilding would be, let's say, Jerusalem per se, as opposed to just the temple. And that's where a lot of these Nehemiah Jesus arguments come from, is that, Daniel didn't say the temple, he said this, he kind of implied the city when he said Jerusalem, maybe. And so therefore, even though Cyrus's decree is much more firm and attested to by other books, and also Darius's decree, this one that was to Ezra personally, that he can kind of get along with the governors and get certain gifts and along the way, and take with him all the gold and stuff, when assuming there's no security. But this isn't something that's mentioned, because like Zechariah had said in Zechariah 2, no, to the one angel, this other angel says there will be no walls. And the walls wasn't something that like was the be all end all. They had these things called siege engines, and they can get over walls and make ramparts around the walls. I mean, you might tell your child, oh, I'm not going to allow you to have a lock on your door, but the lock's not going to, if the child is in danger, keep you from entering. I mean, you're going to maybe take the screws off the hinges or something like that. And but like, when it's the wall kind of doctrine, the walls are mentioned in uh, quite possible quite possibly in most of the renditions for Daniel 7:25. Some translations call it like moats, but nonetheless, I mean, a moat's the same function as the wall. Digging down or building up around the perimeter is the same function, you know. So I don't see this distinction being any real difference. So so let's say um then like when it comes to um Ezra, it's still, you know, kind of Artaxerxes is still kind of just talking about religious matters and put it before his God. You know, these are kind of temple languages. To I guess they already had like cantors and Gibeonites and stuff, but they somehow didn't know how to carry on with the legal aspects of maybe temple service, maybe community service. So they kind of go hand in hand. You're gonna have with your community, um, you know, and your temple. You're gonna need like certain rules and stuff. You think that they have some before they even, you know, in the first few waves of the peopling and the building and stuff like that. But there might have been, you know, some pauses in the building. Like maybe I think Martin Luther mentioned maybe 46 years, which I think strongly points to the kind of Jewish reading of the 7 weeks and then the 62 weeks. But Martin Luther, of course, like I said no. You know, like if you have 175 years, that's 175. You know, that's you can have numbers added up like that. So, um, and then he had some choice words thrown there. So if I do read him, please know if I accidentally read a lot of his choice words, those aren't my words. Like this is just how he felt about the rabbis and his political opponents and all that. But when it comes to Nehemiah or Nehemiah, you know, he's clearly a contemporary of Ezra, as we see in 12. I mean, even earlier, we can look at the high priest in the days of Ezra and the high priest in the days of Nehemiah and cross reference that they are indeed the same person. And you know, they talk about the events, the same events. Ezra reading the law, Nehemiah talks about you know, the denunciation of mixed marriages that Ezra talks about. So it seems to really, you know, it's still Artaxerxes nonetheless, and you know, he's a cupbearer, so he's just, I mean, he might have been like 70 proof or 100 proof for the king today. Well, I'm thinking 100 proof. So, king, it's just so sad after he gets some, you know, towards the where he wants to go to sleep. The king's about ready to go to sleep. He's like, I'm just so sad. I was talking to my friends, my race of people, and they told me something. It's not even mentioned in the book of Ezra, but it's really important. And so somehow the king like gives him this decree to go back there, but it's not even a decree. It's like kind of a commission. It's kind of like, yeah, you can go. And so he's like, I'll write a letter to all these governors of the region, but some of the governors were somehow like didn't like that Nehemiah wouldn't let them be part of the city, so he blamed them as being racist, and then he kind of like made they were just like so like Nehemiah goes on this tirade of that as well as looking at the walls and things of that regard, and then it picks up right here. Lots of cross references to Deuteronomy, Exodus, and Ezra. Um, so it seems like this is, you know, the same story just written again, like it so often does. I mean, that's kind of what the Book of Chronicles is. This is associated with is kind of like a second version or anything like that. And it says right here in chapter 8, it says this is to be read after Ezra 8:36. So apparently, like they kind of had an idea of a law maybe, but they didn't know the new law. So Ezra came with laws, and it's like, look here, Deuteronomy 7. They're like, oh, we didn't know that. We were sorry, Susan. I mean, that's Susan's best name, but it's like you. It's been fun. It's been real. Um, Abraham had many wives. um, so, anyways, so it says right here this should be read like after that. This is the same like event, and then we see Nehemiah talks about the repeopling. So it's almost like to make this argument that I'm not making, that isn't made in any other book, is what they're like actively doing. It's all about the walls and how everyone's against them and how they need to be separate. And even though Nehemiah talks about things that are found in other books, nobody's talking about anything in Nehemiah. Nobody's talking about anything in Esther. And yes, there is like a verse in Ezra 4, I think it's verse 5 or something like that, where maybe verse 6, maybe 4, where it's like, oh, and in the days of Ahasuerus, that that they had some trouble. And so I'm going to read a little bit from the Torah.com. But the Torah.com is just like, contrary to what the rabbis say, it's strong evidence that this is before the second year of Darius, and that's why they didn't move out. And partly because of Mordecai's age, it's like if he was an exile from the actual city, I mean, how young do you expect him to be to come to Jerusalem later in his life, as we might see? But even if not, like he could have moved back to Jerusalem. It's kind of like this narrative that's not part of the biblical narrative. It's like, there's 70 years of exile, and a lot of people never came back. But the point was to come back because that's where God's presence was going to be. This kind of like living in exile was kind of part of a curse, kind of the wandering so and so, that was kind of how they paint the people they thought were cursed when they were blessed. And then lo and behold, it's kind of describing them, and it's like, okay, you got this decree to move back, the financing with all this gold, and it's like you still don't want to come back. That's not really a biblical narrative, So Esther, just the same, is not really corroborated by other books. And same with Nehemiah. Same, and they're not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and so I don't know if this is the argument they were going to make, if it has anything to do with the 490 years, but it's served that purpose nowadays because the vast majority of Christians think they can hang their hat on this, like Don Preston, Martin Luther. There's so many people that teach Bible that think, oh, anti-messianics are done for because we have the 490 years. And it's just such a slam dunk. And in some ways it is, but they think that it's like this ultimate slam dunk, but you'll never see Martin Luther or Don Preston, narrow down the exact years and map this out, because it's really, really difficult, and there's a lot of contradictory information. So, and I was reading the pulpit commentary. They're not even decided. They're kind of saying like, there's this evidence of these Christians are saying this, like I was saying with Nehemiah and Jesus, but there's also, the Jewish perspective has some good arguments, and it's kind of sad that we have to make this about prove Jesus or don't prove Jesus, because that's not where I'm coming from. Like that's not the reason for my season, and all other parties may have kind of a God in this fight. And so I just want to kind of be a fair broker and to kind of get to the bottom of what is this prophecy of the 70 weeks. And so I think I don't want to really talk too much more about Nehemiah. I don't see it as incredibly relevant. It's kind of, to me, a little suspect too, how it seems to all be about this walls when it's happening at the same time of Ezra, that you don't hear any mention of this need to fix the walls. And so I want to again go back to First Esdras and see that, you know, the king, he knows all about the walls. He's not worried about the walls. You know, that's what their enemies are saying is the reason of what they're doing, but that's not ever indicated as why they're not allowed to build. And so it goes on to say a lot of the things that happen in the book of Ezra mostly, but it's supposed to account for the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's not supposed to be like this is another Ezra and then you'll have another Nehemiah. It's like, no, there is no Nehemiah. This is supposed to be everything you need to know from this writer to tell you that whole story. And he's not saying this. He's saying, yes, these are the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, that the holy house be finished. That's what it says here in First Esdras 7:4 and 5. And then they finished it in the 6th year of Darius, 3.5 years later. And there's ways that fits in nicely with the, you know, prophecy of Daniel. But this is not called the Hebrew version. This might be called the Greek version. And in a lot of ways, it's very similar to the Hebrew version of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's telling the same story, just a little different order, a few things thrown in. So that here in the story of Ezra and Nehemiah in the Greek version, you don't really have this whole narrative of the king of Ammon and the king of Samaria and the king of Edom. They joined together to thwart the efforts because they wanted free access to the city that they didn't really care about too much until somebody else wanted it. And it's kind of a narrative that's fun today in a lot of ways. You know, there's nobody there and they only want to be there because we want to be there. It doesn't really make any sense at all, but it's some kind of weird narrative that they try to spin. And so, you know, it's got the same stories, the mixed marriages, not allowed to do that. And then it ends with part of Nehemiah. So Nehemiah then also in this Breton Septuagint, you know, kind of just jumps in the story and tells his narrative. And then it just goes to like Judith maybe, or Tobit. And there's Astra in here, but we don't have the original Septuagint. We don't know if these books were in the original Septuagint. But they are in this Brenton Septuagint. And let me read from the Septuagint, Daniel, so I can put this big old book to the side for a while to show you something else. But am I Daniel right here? But I think it really is attested to this argument of Cyrus and the importance of that, because I think that's talked about in Isaiah, and I think my way of looking at it more aligns with the prophecy of Jeremiah. This idea of, oh, you got to focus on the city and not the temple, and then it all adds up and to the exact year. Because as the pulpit commentary said, I was reading earlier, they said, you know, if this was written as, like, there's some good evidence that this was written in the 2nd century, and if he is, or maybe even like the 4th or 5th century, and if he's kind of ignorant of things in that time, why do you expect him to, in the nicest way, ignorant? I mean, pulpit's not an anti-biblical, it's just like the exact dates, and all that. And why would you expect him to be to be such a stickler on the exact dates? 70, like I said in the last video, 70 is like has cultural and religious significance in the linguistic way, because it's connected to other words that have those similar meanings. And so, like for instance, Lamech said, I'll be forgiven 7 times 70. And it's just like the word 70 is just like the plural word for 7. And they both can mean like fullness. And it gets rather confusing in that way. And they also happen to mean Saturday too, which makes it even more complicated. But I don't think people tend to read any of those into Daniel's prophecy. I think they tend to think about it as numerical. The pulpit commentary even got into the gematria, which I would not recommend at all. I don't think that's what was going on. Maybe, I mean, like Theodotion and Jerome and everybody's had their hands in Daniel. We don't have like the original Daniel, and even in the Masoretic Text, they don't put it with the prophets. It's kind of like a catch-all. And when Ezekiel talks about Daniel, you got to remember Ezekiel was kind of even an old man when he was prophesying, and Daniel was like a boy when he left Jerusalem. So it's hard to think Ezekiel is saying Daniel's this great prophet. Daniel is probably some sort of Aramaic title for like wisdom that they got from the 70 years in Babylon or something like that. I mean, it's probably a lot more confusing than I'm explaining it. But like we said in the last video, Ahasuerus and Artaxerxes, even at a time, may be nobody other than Cambyses, who was a short rule between Cyrus and Darius. And it's not Xerxes, unless Xerxes is simply a title. It's not these Xerxes the Great. And this Darius, son of Ahasuerus, is not like Darius II, son of Xerxes, or anything crazy like that, because he would be the king of the Persia, not the Mede. And Daniel, even if he came as a kid, let's say Daniel was born in 580. Well, we're not going to get down to 430 or something and have this make any sense. So this Darius is actually like the guy who was standing in for Cyrus after Cyrus joined an alliance with the Medes and went to fight the Scythians or something like this, Martin Luther said. As I'm understanding correctly. But he wasn't talking about this passage of Daniel. He was talking about the 2nd year of Darius. I can't remember why he said that. It's in my other video. If anybody wants to know, because it's in context, or email me, I could figure that out. But this is what it says here in Daniel 9. And It has to do with him how yearning, like really wanting to have the captivity over. He said, understood by the books of the number of years, which was the word of the Lord to Jeremiah. So that's strong evidence that the 490 years began around 600 when Jeremiah was prophesying. So that puts us in more like if he was prophesying in 605, in 483 years, we're talking like the 120s or something, like to where like this is really good evidence for the monumental times of Hebrew roots during the Maccabean era, where we get Hanukkah from. And that would be my position. I'm still an open mind about this. I'm learning with you, but I did come on with my own conclusions, which I will provide. And they're different than my past conclusions, and they'll probably be changed again. But I'm learning, and if everybody wants to contribute, I do welcome comments. So it says they transgress by the law. This is very much like Zechariah saying, Ezekiel is kind of telling them to do this. It's like, oh, return to God. This is what the Zakir means in the names is Ezekiel and Zechariah. And so it says, incline thine ear, O God. So it's like, hey, we waited. We're looking to you. So now it's time for you to fulfill the word of Zechariah, or sorry, Jeremiah, which would be the end of Babylon. And he had good reason to think that was it, because 7 years had gone by and the king of Babylon. Remember that whole dream he had? I think it was in chapter 5, Tini Thekel Kum or something, and it was the hand and the writing was on the wall. And he, because he drank from the goblet and his time was up. And so Babylon's gone. So we know it's not just the Babylon being gone. It has something to do with also the rest of that, which is the kind of bride and bridegroom. And, they kind of think, oh, if God left because we were unrighteous, then we have to be righteous, then God will return. The voice of the bridegroom. So cry a lament for 70 years, then sing songs of a dirge or something. What Jesus said, he said, like, this look, how can I compare this generation? And so he says, "O Lord, thy mercy is over all." And now, O God, hearken of the prayer of thy servants' supplications to cause thy face to shine in the desolate sanctuary. So that verse, at least, isn't about the city. It's about the sanctuary, the temple. Some of the other verses may be more about. I don't know if anybody says. I don't know if these verses about a wall. He wasn't like, "Oh Lord, please bring us back to Jerusalem. Please come back to the temple." And oh yeah, big walls. I'm talking better than last time. If only we had those walls, then Nebuchadnezzar would have nothing on us. And so he's supplicating and giving obeisance and contrite heart and all the things that he's supposed to be doing, I guess. And says we sin, admit, confess the sins and repent and all that, right? And says right then and there, as this was happening, God came talking about the holy mountain. So that, I mean, the temple is the kind of like the highest point on the mountain. So this could refer to the temple. I don't think it's referring to Zion. Zion's a little Zion's kind of this forsaken place south of the temple that's not in the city. And so he says he wants to give him understanding. Well, why'd you speak in a riddle then? He's like, okay, I'm explaining what's going on. So he touched me about the hour of evening sacrifice, and he instructed me and spoke with me and said, "O Daniel, I come for to impart understanding. At the beginning of this supplication, the word came forth, and I'm come to tell you." So here's how he's like, "Oh, the 70 years has been accomplished for Jerusalem to lay waste," and here's like, "Okay, I heard you. Here's what I say." Okay, so this is like God speaking right here for the next few verses in the Septuagint. To the end of the chapter, here we go. 70 weeks have been determined upon my people and upon the holy city, for the sin is in, for sin to be ended, and for the seal up transgressions. So, 70 weeks determined seems to be talking to Jeremiah. Jeremiah said that God had determined 70 weeks, and I guess to make up the Sabbaths, kind of is just this plea bargain, and then this is the justice. This is 70 weeks of um, 70 years, and uh, so this kind of way that this is usually understood, even though we don't exactly know what 70 weeks means, because like I said, the difficulty with terms 7 and 70. Let's ignore that. Let's say for the rest of the video, let's say I made my piece, I said my piece. Let's just assume that this means 70 weeks, and it doesn't say years. It's like, oh, Daniel, it's 7 times what you thought. That you thought 70 you thought 70 years. You thought 70 years. Well, it was 77s. 77s. Think about it. And he doesn't give me really any explanation. So, okay, let's say I make my peace with that and go with the common reading. I mean, this kind of goes against what Martin Luther was saying. This would almost make you think that the 70 weeks would begin at the decree, because they're substituting they're not jumping at the end. You have to hear this, like, you just add it to this period and start at some arbitrary point and have a gap. And no, this is, oh, you didn't understand it right. It wasn't. It sounded like years, but it was weeks, bro. It was no, not weeks, but it was, you heard years, but it was 7 years. It was, you heard 7 years, but it was 77 years. 70 times 7 years. Okay. So that's just that. Don't blame me. That's just how it's commonly accepted to be interpreted. And then it says, so this, when it says upon thy people, what does this mean? Does it have something to do with turn away the anger from the city? So the city would mean the people who have sinned, or something like this? Or does it have to do with like right here at the end of verse 25, it says, "The time shall be exhausted," and then like, they shall be cut off with a flood in verse 26, and at the end of time, we should put an end. shall be put to desolation. Is in, from verse 27. So I mean, it wouldn't make sense to kind of have like this parallel, structure. But I'm not talking with the end of any people. Don't get me twisted. I'm not like this IDF where they can kind of think, oh well, if only those other people didn't exist. Like, nope, not me. I'm not saying that. Uh, but so it's like, um, so it says for so the 70 weeks have been determined upon that people for sin to be ended and to seal up transgressions and to blot out iniquities and to make atonement for iniquities and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal the vision and the prophet and to anoint the most holy. So to me, that's kind of saying like when all this is said and done and everything's busted down, then we'll realize that this was what the prophets had always said, and we can confirm that this was a prophet and this was a saint, and he was telling the truth, even though the people hated him. And then after all this time, you'll have like this new system where you have this most holy, and he's going to be anointed. And like, who is this? I mean, probably at the time it was written, it was probably somebody like Alexander Jannaeus, who was this narcissist who thought that if he crucified all his enemies, then he would be the top priest and king, or something like this, and um that's most likely when this was written, and I'll prove that. So give me a second, and I'll prove that. But let's get through reading the Septuagint version of Daniel, chapter 9. So it says that what I read of thus far was verse 24. So verse 25 says, "And thou shalt know and understand that from the going forth." So he's explaining the 70 weeks still. That from the going forth, this is Gable talking about what the 70 weeks mean. That from the going forth of the command for the answer and for the building of the city of Jerusalem until Christ the Prince, there shall be 70 weeks. So from going forth of the command to answer and for the building of Jerusalem until the coming Prince, there shall be 7 weeks. 7 weeks. And 62 weeks. And 62 weeks. So Martin Luther maybe has a point that this is how Hebrew uses the noun. 7 years and 5 years. Like 100 years and 75 years. So it's saying this week's and that week's, and that's what the Hebrew literally does say. The Hebrew, it does have a lot of ands in there, and they just kind of jumble them all up. The 70s, and the 7, and the 60, and the 2s, and that's just how it's written. So it's kind of hard, and there's no periods, so we can't just. And I'm not even a Hebrew premissist, and I'm saying this was redacted much later. So, I mean, who's really to tell what's really going on here, even if we did have exact words? So I think it's more germane to figure out what's being said than to get into the minutia of what each vowel means and all this, especially with exegesis and things like that. And it says that from the going forth of the command for the answer and the building of Jerusalem. So it seems that the command for the answer and the building of Jerusalem could mean that we don't start the 70 weeks until Jerusalem is built. And that's why, these kind of Nehemiah people would say, oh, that's why we start the clock at 451 or 444 or whatever it is. And then but I don't know. I mean, it says from the going forth, because we saw that was the going forth of the command was back in the days of Jeremiah, 600. So that's 150 years difference. So that's kind of like impossible to reconcile. It's got to be one or the other. It's like you can't really reconcile those two. You can't really say the time of the going forth of the command and for the building of Jerusalem, unless the going forth of the command and the building go together, which happened in the days of Cyrus and happened in the days of Darius. So that's kind of puts good evidence for two dates that are in the middle of these two dates that I already offered, which also have strong evidence as being corroborated by other books of the Bible. And as being commands, more meaningful commands, more explicit. Nehemiah, he's having problems with governors. He doesn't tell them that he has a command from the king, get them in trouble with their king or anything. It's just like, he's just, oh, God did this, God did this. And so it's not really that much of a decree in a lot of ways, like it was kind of a personal favor to him, just, and Artaxerxes toward the same king toward Ezra at the same time. I mean, it seems more he commissioned that man for a certain role. So maybe that's what they mean. It'll take from the time of Darius to the time of Ezra 50 years. There'll be 7 weeks. Maybe that's what it means, until the anointed Ezra, has some purpose there, that he can anoint Eliashib or whatever it is, like that's going to be 1 week after the decree of Cyrus, for instance, which would put us in like 480 or something, which would be, another date that's could be useful to Christians, the birth of Jesus, but they really focus on this when he's cut off, and they won't ride with that. So it says that there should be 7 weeks, comma, and 62 weeks, semicolon. And then the time shall return, and the streets shall be built, and the wall, and the times shall be exhausted. So this is saying that it's not going to be until, like, let's say you take this date of Nehemiah, it's not going to be until 50 AD or whatever, like, so if you had 490 to that day of Nehemiah, where it's like after the walls, it's not going to be till 483 years from the word going out till time returns and the streets shall be built. So if the streets are being built in the days of Nehemiah, it's like, oops, too early. It says 490 years. You can't build the streets because it says right here. So what I'm saying, this sounds like to me in the Septuagint version is that they can't build anything until the 490 years are over. There's going to be no building. So that's makes this whole idea of Nehemiah impossible. It says, for the times return, for the time shall return, That, I don't even know what that means. And the street shall be built, and the wall, and the wall, and the wall. I thought Nehemiah was building the wall. And the time should be exhausted. And that's almost like saying, like, you got to exhaust all this time for this time to return, that you're going to have this kingdom again. You'd have to exhaust all these 490 years. And so from whatever decree, you got to go to basically the time of Christ, more or less, maybe to if we use the decree of Jeremiah, to the time of the Maccabees. That's where I'm kind of leaning. Then that's you can't build until then. That's when you're going to build. And verse 26, it says, after 62 weeks. So Martin Luther will say 62 and 7 weeks. That's a perfectly normal way to talk. 62 weeks and 7 weeks. Yeah, I say it all the time. Hey, how much change do I get for that? Oh, you get 62 and 7 cents. 62 and 7. That's a perfect 62 cents and 7 cents. That's what you get. So let's say that's granted. Well, the next verse, it says, after the 62 weeks. After the 62 weeks. After the 62 weeks. Isn't it after the 62 and 7? It goes 7, 70, 62, and then 62. Like, it doesn't. Where'd the 7 go? And as it says here, after talking about all the street exhausted and all that, they say 62. Is that an abbreviated way of saying it? How many cents do I got? Oh, you got 62 cents and 7 cents. Yeah. 62, 7 cents and 62 cents. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, about that 62 cents. When do I get that? Then they're going to give you 62 cents. They think you forgot about the 7 cents. It's not an abbreviated way of talking. So after 62 weeks, the anointed one. So that makes more sense with thinking that there was an anointed one in the building way back for 7 weeks that, let's say, ended like in the second year of Darius, when we see all this stuff happening with Zerubbabel and Zechariah. I mean, that would make a lot more sense for this coming of 7 years, and then the street, then it's going to be built, and you have an anointed one, and especially in the context of all the fantastic things that are happening in front of Zechariah's eyes, these kind of ways that God stepped through the fabric of time and into existence and kind of appeared through all these symbols and visions and stuff like that. We want to say Zechariah is just off his loon or something, which I'm not going there. I've been appreciating reading a little Zechariah here and there. And not that I think, we can see those things or something, but it's pointing to the significance of said event, namely the anointing of the governor and the priest, the high priest. So it says, after 62 weeks, the anointed one shall be destroyed. So this is something entirely different. This has strong Maccabean connotations as well as Christian connotations. The Christians will definitely gravitate towards this first, as well as people that like have a Maccabean ending. I'm yet to see somebody that, like I said, doesn't have a God in the fight, that says that the word went out during the days of Nehemiah, and then there's some other person to be destroyed around the same time as Jesus that was the anointed one or something. You know what I mean? Like, it seems that all the people saying this whole Nehemiah thing happen to have vested interest in the end date of when this time would end. And the people who are against this theory seem to just want to disprove that. And I'm not here to do either of those. So it says here, so it says, after 62 weeks, the anointed one shall be destroyed. Another rendering of this could be the anointing, like the ability to anoint, like basically the role of king or the role of high priest shall be cut off. And this, like I said in my video, I was wrong to put this on Preston's own track, but he seems to be against all forms of gaps, but he seems to kind of put this gap of 40 years for the city to be destroyed. He doesn't really explain that unless I missed it. And so the Messiah gets cut off, and then 40 years until the city destroyed. That's not in Daniel's prophecy. But like a lot of these people hang their hat on Daniel's prophecy to point to the Christian things, but the destruction of Jerusalem is clearly pointed to in this section. And Martin Luther says that the Jewish people admit this, that so we know the ending date, we know the 70 is where it ends. The kind of specifics are getting very murky. And what was I saying? Oh yeah, Jewish people might say the 490 years begins at let's say the destruction of the first temple and the second and Herod's temple being destroyed, or something like so. These are these two bookends for them. And of course, Don Preston would realize the import of the destruction of Jerusalem. But what I was kind of trying to indicate in the video is that's kind of where our timeline would lead us. But I'm almost positive when he's hanging his hat, the hook he's hanging on is this kind of Nehemiah view, this kind of wall doctrine. Like, so if it's in the Bible, like I said about his view on Jesus mentioning Daniel 9, if it's in the Bible, then this is what it means. So if Nehemiah is talking about the walls, who's Don Preston to say otherwise? And I think that's how he looks at it. And but like I was saying, a few things about the Dead Sea Scrolls, them not being found, and I'm going to show you a little more from First Esdras, not from the book. We read from First Esdras, but I want to show you what First Esdras is. But let's get through. I'll do that in about 2 minutes. Let's just finish this last verse or two. So it says, when the anointed one will be destroyed, and there is judgment in him. And there's no judgment in him. There's no judgment in him. So maybe Christians are right. This is like, oh, he's done no wrong. Like, what does this mean? There's no judgment in him. Or maybe he was a bad ruler and he got cut off or something. Maybe some people would argue. It says, and he shall destroy the city and the sanctuary and he shall. So that's almost looks like it's talking like this it's only a colon that goes to this next section. It's not even a separate sentence. And it says, and he shall destroy the city and sanctuary with the prince that is coming. So this almost sounds like there's two people, which is real hard argument for Christians. But the Septuagint, the pulpit commentary says this. They say the Septuagint version is a really rough version, but they can see where each word comes from. So they're they're almost saying it's a too literal of a translation. But I mean, what does the pulpit know about Greek primacy? Probably more than me, but I'm sure they know a lot about Hebrew and might have a bias too. So it says, "And he shall destroy the city and the sanctuary with the prince that is coming." The prince that is coming. So this kind of rules out, a high priest of Jerusalem as the prince who's coming. That's got to be some sort of like Seleucid Empire, Antiochus Fourth. I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. Antiochus the Fourth would be the prince that's to come. And said, "They shall be cut off with a flood, and to the end of the war, which is rapidly completed, he shall appoint the city to desolations." So until the end of the war, Antiochus is going to pretty much wreak havoc on the city. Maybe Don Preston would say this is 70 AD. I mean, it's hard to say. "And 1 week shall establish a covenant with many. In the midst of the week, my sacrifice and drink offering shall be taken away, and the temple shall be the abomination of desolations. And at the end of time, an end shall be put to desolation." So there's going to be desolation until the height of desolation, and then no more desolation. And right before the pinnacle of this is going to be the abomination that causes desolation, called the abomination of desolations. And this is strongly attested to in the Maccabees. If you go to the Torah.com and search around, you'll be able to find how the stories of Hanukkah and the stories of Maccabees and all that, like, this is really interwound in the book of Daniel, and severely so. And everybody knows this, that really studies this. I'm surprised that we don't have more people being honest about these kind of things. So that's the Septuagint. And I read from First Ezra, and I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, well, that doesn't prove anything. That doesn't prove there's no Nehemiah or anything. I don't know. Let's take a look at this. But before we do, just so I can prove my point about the Torah, I couldn't find the article, the Torah.com. I couldn't find the article I was looking for about Daniel 9, which would have been really helpful for this video. But I did find another one that was kind of interesting. I didn't really read too much of it, but I'll just read a little bit from there, maybe get people to look for themselves at some of this. It says the actual authors, whose names are unknown to us, these might be Samaritans for all I know. I don't know what the Torah.com is. I'm not like a big fan or anything. I've just been reading it the last couple of days, or just found it like a couple of days ago. When describing events that have already occurred as if they are yet to come, make use of coded language to recount his story symbolically. This is pretty critical. I mean, you might want to tune out now before I offend somebody. But it's called the Torah.com, so pardon me. The relation of these descriptions to actual events, as we know them from other sources, is quite often precise. Although some of the references in Daniel may seem too vague, when they are laid together, there is only one set of events that will fit them: the on and off again wars between the Seleucids and Ptolemies. To be sure, the visions collected in Daniel 7 and 12 differ significantly from the other. Daniel 7, 8, and 9 are more generally references to world history and more powerful symbolically. But I'm telling you, even in those verses, it's serious. The beef is real. And then before 7, it's like people say you can't, have some alternate meaning. You can't take like the old meaning and have some new writer kind of see more meaning. And I'm kind of thinking that's what it is. If you really look at what happened, it's like they added, they took the core of Daniel, which is 2 through 7, and all the lessons learned in Aramaic and the years of Babylon, and then they added a few Aramaic verses to tie it up, and then did the rest in Hebrew that isn't even the same story. It's like it came much later, and it has, and these 4 kingdoms, like the fourth, was only a thought when the original section came out, but at this point had become the ruling power. And so Daniel 7 through 12, I think, is quite late, and Tori thinks it's pretty late too, but they're saying especially certain chapters. But so he's talking about the long vision, and Daniel 11 is what's the most interesting for him here. So, but I'm saying like all of that section you can tell. But he's saying the coming of Alexander is obvious. He says 11:3, the warrior king will appear, who will have extensive dominion and do as he pleases. The Diadachi splitting the Greek empire upon Alexander's death. Verse 4, but after his appearance, his kingdom will be broken up and scattered to the 4 winds of heaven, but not for any of his posterity, nor with dominion like that which he had, for his kingdom will be uprooted and belong to others beside these. The Potomac kingdom, the king of the south will grow powerful, verse 5. Seleucus 1, Nicator, again, verse 5. However, one of his officers will overpower him and rule, having extensive dominion. Verses 6 through 21 describe the overall history of the region throughout the rise of Antiochus IV. And I'm saying that this is in chapter 7 too. People just can't see it. With special emphasis on Judea, marriage alliances between the north and south will be attempted, and wars between the kingdoms will be fought. Eventually, the king of the north will install himself within a beautiful land, Judea. His place will be taken by a contemptible man, Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Verse 14, in those times, many will resist the king of the south, and the lost sons of your people, Jews allied with the Seleucids, will assert themselves to confirm the vision. So his persecution begins in 168, which makes kind of the 490 years almost impossible, no matter how you slice it. But like I was saying earlier, there's no reason to think these are exact numbers. It says, he will set his mind against the Holy Covenant, verse 28. This is Antiochus IV placed in authority, a Jewish high priest, and others who would support him, and quote unquote, abolish the regular offerings and set up an appalling abomination. This is the image of Olympic Zeus, which placed in Temple in 167. It says in verse 33, the knowledgeable among the people will make the many understand, and for a while they shall fall by the sword, the flame, captivity. So he talks about the end of the Persian rule in verse 2. It says, and I will tell you the truth, Persia will have 3 more kings. The 4th will be wealthier than all the power he obtains through the wealth. He will stir everyone up against the kingdom of Greece. So it says that they're even talking about the specifics. It says Bernice's brother, Ptolemy III. Like, this is deep. Bernice's brother, Ptolemy III Ergitus, takes the throne of Egypt and attacks the Seleucids. And then they say in verse 7, a shoot from her stock will appear in its place, will come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north. He will fight and overpower him. He will also take the gods of their molten images. So, like, this is painfully detailed to the specifics. Like every single thing that happened. And not like oh, there was a two-headed dragon, or he had wings like an eagle, but he had like a lion, but it was two heads, and he had three teeth on one side, and I mean, like, not that difficult, like Nostradamus kind of stuff. Like, this is just this is a little more precise. So it talks about this, this north and south, and I venture to suggest that this was actually where the four beasts terminate too, because they talk about this the feet of iron and the very toes. They're this iron mixed with clay that like don't mix, and I think that's too referencing the same time period, as well as lots of Daniel 7 to represent this time period, but especially the other chapters. So it talks even about the death of Antiochus. It says in verse 19, he will head back to his strongholds, no land will be stumble and fall. This is all talk about Maccabees, the killing of the high priest Onias III. It says here in verse 22 of Daniel 11, the forces of the flood will be overwhelmed by him and will be broken, and so too the covenant leader. And from that time, an alliance is made with him. He will practice deceit. And so this is like this fake, Pergamum priest. And so, like, a lot of this really sounds like what Daniel 9 is pointing to. I mean, it really does to me. And I think even uh, even John MacArthur knows this. I mean, he's going to subscribe to or ascribe to the, like that Christian Nehemiah 450 idea, but he can't help but realize that there is some truth to all this that I'm saying. He can't help but see that I'm not lying. So I don't know. I see the four key. I see the Diadachi, the Greeks in Daniel 7, like when like the fourth beast, just like the statue, even if I'm not sure these are the same kingdoms as the statue, but let's say they are. It doesn't directly say that, but if you do take that, this fourth, they talk about iron, and it says they got the 10 horns. If you count Alexander, 10 is the perfect number to get you down through that line to the Diadachis and Antiochus fourth Epiphany, especially. But this isn't. I mean, I'm reading John MacArthur's study notes right now, and he's not seeing any of this. Like he's seeing this as about the um, the Romans, and eventually, he's been influenced by the anti-papists through the years and the Westminster Confession and everything. So, he's going to believe it's this Rome and all this, but I don't think Rome was even a thought at this time. And so he doesn't see when it says the 10 horns anything to do with history. There were four kingdoms of the Greeks. That's impossible to mean what it might mean. So it says given to his time for a time and time and a half time. This is here in Daniel 7 a mention of Daniel 9, I think, clearly. And this is probably, if you read Daniel 7 and Daniel 10, like this is probably has to do with the kingdom coming and dominion giving the Son of Man here in 7:14, and to him was given dominion, glory, kingdom, that the peoples of every nation, language might serve him. His dominion will be everlasting. So it says that in verse 14, and then it says here in verse 27, then the sovereignty and dominion and greatness of all the kingdoms of all whole heaven will be given to the people of the saints of the highest one. His kingdom will be an everlasting kingdom, and all this. So I think that this coming of the one like the Son of Man is kind of like the coming of the kingdom of Daniel 7, which I think has a lot of parallels to Daniel 9. So this must be, when everlasting righteousness and all that. I'm not looking for John MacArthur for that. I mean, I don't know how inspired he all is. I haven't found anything that he said that I'm just like, well, thanks, John MacArthur. Now I really see. Now my heart burns within me. Now the Spirit is coming upon me. I don't really get that from John MacArthur. He's too much of like a radical Calvinist that wants to just kind of beat people up with his supreme uh, grace and blessings and stuff like that. That he's so much better than everyone else, and I don't know. So it says here in chapter 8 that I saw a ram budding westward, northward, southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor is there any to rescue. So this is obviously Alexander, right? Oh wait, sorry. This was one. There's two horns that was longer than the other. So this is the Medo Persian. So this is like Cyrus, that committed an empire. Um, that's what Cyrus did. Isaiah said he would do it. So it says the goat, verse 5. This is John MacArthur. The goat, verse 5, represents Greece with its great horn, Alexander, who, with his army of 3,500, moved with such speed his picture is not even touching the ground. So it says the four horns are the generals who became kings over the four sectors of the Grecian Empire after Alexander. Go to Daniel 7:6. Daniel 7:6. After this, I look up and behold one like another, and leopard with on his back, four wings, four heads. Okay. Okay, John MacArthur, that was kind of unexpected. To point me there. It says four, but I had said that you wouldn't say that. Maybe. So, look like a man, verse 8:15. When I, Daniel, saw it and understood it, behold, standing there, looked like a man. This is Gabriel. Right. So the little horn, to me, it says, like in Daniel 7:23, the fourth beast will be, and for 10 horns, and one will rise will be different than the previous ones and subdue three kings. I don't know if this is what Zechariah 11 is talking about, where three shepherds will be cast down. I don't think it is. I think this is the Seleucid Empire, and it's pointing to this one, the little horn. I think that's what this 10th horn is, the little horn. And so when you go to chapter 8, it's clearly talking about Alexander. John MacArthur agrees with it. And and the little horn is Antiochus. Um, because it says right here, the small horn is Antiochus Epiphanes. Uh, this is what John MacArthur says. The little horn clearly represents Antichrist. The reason both are described as little horns, he says elsewhere is described as Antichrist. In 11, I guess, which we would just a far more just detailed this summary will come. He says in chapters 11, and he pretty much quotes the whole, refers to the whole chapter. But we just went through 11 and it was all about the Greeks. Remember, we were seeing all the parallels brought to us by the Torah.com. I mean, there was too many to count. Like, you can go look at it yourselves. I even gave you a few snippets. I mean, it was like line after line. Every single line was referring to an event that happened. But he's saying, oh, you're only here in chapter 8. John MacArthur's saying, once you get to chapter 11, you'll know it's Antichrist. This little horn that he says is Antiochus Epiphanes, it's got to be the Antichrist. But he's not saying it's the Antichrist. He's saying this is, like, he does this kind of stuff. He's not a preterist. He's a futurist. So this is a glimpse, or this is, yeah, it refers to something, but there's a second fulfillment, or however way he does it. I mean, it doesn't really make sense to me. So it says he frightened and he fell. So he says the Grafton sector will be divided into 4 parts. This is John MacArthur. One of these, the Syrian. So eventually the Antiochus Epiphanes, little horn. Secondly, the little horn in verse 9, the Antichrist in the last days. So he's saying, oh, you can go to this verse and it's Antiochus Epiphanes, but in the next verse it's talking about the end of time. So they do that all the time. They'll just bifurcate some prophecy into 2 parts with a 2,000-year gap in between. This is how futurists do. And which would kind of defeat any argument they have about the 490 years. If you can just push pause and play and fast forward as much as you want, what's the point of any time prophecy? And in the first year, he says, this may mean that Darius, a title, not a proper name, refers to Cyrus, since Cyrus was the first monarch of the Medo-Persian Empire. This time, note was, so that's another way you can reconcile it, is to understand that Darius could mean Cyrus, but we both agree that it's way back, 530 BC. It talks about the curse, restoration, the man Gabriel. So he's saying that it goes from 445 BC to 70 weeks. This is what in the NASB, this is, I don't think John MacArthur shows how this reads, but this is what it says. It says 70 weeks have been decreed for your people in your holy city to finish your transgression and make an end of sin, to make an atonement for iniquity, to bring everlasting righteousness, to seal vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy place. So you are to know and discern that the issuing of the decree to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah, the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. So it kind of like is saying that for this 69 weeks, there's going to be no Messiah and then there's the bookend from this date till this date. There's going to be no Messiah, And during this time, it's going to be built with moat, even times the stress. And because it's talking about this 490 years, it's like during this whole time, 409 years is going to be built. And that makes sense. It's not like after they finished building the temple or it's alleged Nehemiah finished building the walls, that building stopped. They didn't build anything during the time of Maccabees, during the time of Herod. Like that's ridiculous, you know. So it's not like, oh yeah, the building only happened during these 7 years, and during the next 62 years, no building happened. But it's kind of a difficult sentence because it's kind of like that sentence in Matthew where it's like, oh, not one word or jot or tittle will pass away from the law until heaven and earth be destroyed, and then until all things be filled. It's like, well, which one is it? Is it until all things be fulfilled or until heaven and earth be destroyed? And it's kind of like that. It's like they're going to be building until the time when there's not going to be building anymore. And they're going to be building until the time of Messiah. So I guess that's what he's saying, is that for 69 weeks, there's going to be building some of the times of stress or all the time during this stress. Or maybe saying that there's going to be this interrupted time, but the language doesn't agree with that. It just says it will be done during, and like I said, there's no periods or anything. So it says there will be 70, 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. But it's saying like from the decree to the time of Messiah, it's going to be built with moat. This is what he's saying. This is what his version in ASP is saying. It's going to be built with streets, roads, and moats. And moats can mean walls. So how is it built with streets, roads, and moats when they weren't allowed to build anything? Moats are for protection, right? The whole beef about the walls was the protection, right? So how can they, I'm asking John MacArthur, how can they be said to be building the city for 483 years from the time the word got out so he's saying, well, that's obviously this time of Nehemiah. That's when when the word has gone out, and so it's going to be built this whole time. So this has nothing to do with Darius. This has nothing to do with Cyrus. The word he's saying has to do with Nehemiah. He says right here, he says, these are the weeks of years, whereas the weeks, this is John MacArthur, days are prescribed as different ways. The time spans from the Persian Artaxerxes decree to rebuild Jerusalem in 445. Nehemiah to the Messiah's kingdom. This panorama includes 7 weeks or 49 years, possibly closing Nehemiah's career in the rebuilding of Jerusalem, as well as the end of the ministry of Malachi at the close of the Old Testament. 62 weeks or 434 years more, for a total of 483, is the first advent of Messiah. This was fulfilled at the triumphant entry. So the advent's not his birth. He's saying that's about, like right before he died is his advent. So when he came to Jerusalem, the Messiah will be cut off. Come reference to death, the final 7 years or the 70th week of the time of Antichrist. So obviously he's got a huge gap here. So everything was exact year, down to the day, according to Calvary San Diego. And then this final year, the 70 weeks, is the time of Antichrist, time of Antichrist. Roman people from whom the Antichrist will come will destroy the city and its temple in 70 AD. So he too admits that 70 AD. So he believes in it's the time of the Antichrist, which is, let's say, to John MacArthur, the year 2030. And then it's also the year of the time of the destruction of the temple, year 70, but it's also the time of the advent of Jesus, the year 30. Like, what? This 1 week, this last week. Like, how does that make any sense? So he says, verse 24, this highly complex and startlingly accurate prophecy answers Daniel's prayer, not with reference to near history, but giving future of Israel, the final end of the age. God promises two sets of accomplishments each: atonement, sin, and transgressions, all ending. Um, bringing righteousness, seal up vision, anoint the whole, consecrate the holy place. So in a temple, meaning the future, that will be a center of worship in the millennial kingdom, John MacArthur says. Ezekiel chapters 40 through 48. So he's saying that this 490 years spans into his future somehow. So this 490 years is somehow 2,500 years. He says, this is clearly the end of the age, the second advent, judgment, because the bringing uh, bringing in the righteousness to not incur 7 years after the death of the Messiah. So he's putting a big gap and throwing it at the end of time. And he's got all this kind of dispensationalist rhetoric about Jacob's trouble and all that. But John MacArthur is not against. Oh, I was going to read about First Ezra. It's just getting so late. Okay. So I'm thinking a lot of people that don't put it in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah have a serious problem with verse 25. It says that it's going to be built this whole time when they say it's not built until Ezra and Nehemiah. For the people that say Ezra and Nehemiah, this kind of late decree from Artaxerxes is the beginning of the time. They still have tons of problems. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think it's too much in the book of. So this is gonna be a 3-part. I'm getting so tired. I got so much to do. So let me just prove that he doesn't throw everything in the future. He realizes that this is a Greek time period. I showed you all the places um, where in chapter 7 and 8 he mentioned Antiochus and the Greek and all this. So he realizes this, and so it says 3 more kings and a fourth. It's talking about Cyrus, Cambyses, so Darius, Hephaestus. Um, I don't know. So he's going with the NIV rendering that Ahasuerus is Xerxes and Artaxerxes is Artaxerxes and all that. So that's where he is with the but he's saying it's he's saying this is going all the way down to encounter with the Greeks, basically. He says verse 4 is about Alexander's death. Um, he has the same perspective. Like what I was reading from the Torah.com, he's got the same idea that the king of the north and king of the south is the Ptolemies. He says the same thing about Bernice, daughter of Egyptian too, Egypt's Ptolemy too, Philadelphus, and like he goes through this. Syria's attacked Egypt in 240. Like he, all of his notes are about this Greek era. And then he goes down to Antiochus, verse 17. He's talking once again about the little horn, fourth Epiphanies. When he's saying this, all about the Antichrist, right? We'll get a real good idea of who the Antichrist is when this is all about Antiochus. And talks about his fall in 19. We're still talking about Antiochus in 24. Antiochus in 25, according to John MacArthur. Antiochus in 27. Antiochus in 28. In Daniel 11:29, Antiochus fourth Epiphanies, according to John MacArthur. Desecrate the sanctuary, 31, John MacArthur. Antiochus. Verse 34, Antiochus. Then, by the time he gets to verse 35, he says, these two eschatological terms point to a forward leap across thousands of years of history, from Antiochus to a future similar trial. Wow, John MacArthur. Wow. Transported across time. Oh, wait. Then they talk about the king of the north and the south again in verse 40. What do you do there, John MacArthur? Oh, nope, it's about the Antichrist. It says king north and south, which had always talked about being the Greek north and south. But all of a sudden, this is about the Antichrist at the end of time, right? So I just wanted to show you, lastly, before I do my final conclusions, on Daniel's 70 weeks. So this is gonna be a 3-part video. But yeah, I think if you don't put it at the time of Nehemiah, you got a real problem with the city walls being rebuilt in Daniel 7:25, when they can't be built until Nehemiah. But where was I? So it says first Esdras. Y'all thinking, oh well, this is just copied off of Ezra and Nehemiah, so they probably had an agenda. They don't want you to know that Jesus came exactly after the end of 490 years. So it says it is considered canonical in the East. The Greek Septuagint, the Old Latin Bible, and related Bible versions included Esdras A, First Esdras, and Esdras B, Ezra Nehemiah. So First Esdras is actually Ezra A, and Ezra Nehemiah is Ezra B. So the name refers to translators by the Greek Esdras A. The Septuagint calls it Esdras A, while the Vulgate calls it 3 Esdras. It is considered apocryphal by Jerome. So if you want to blame the whole Catholic Church, you should be reading the Greek version of First Ezra of Ezra, which has nothing to do with this whole wall story. So it says that citations in early Christian writings claimed by the scriptural Book of Ezra without qualification are taken from First Esdras and never from Ezra sections of Ezra Nehemiah, or as known in the Septuagint, Ezra's B. So the Ezra Nehemiah, the one you have in our Bibles, me and you, this is never referred to by the church fathers. They refer to First Esdras, also known as Esdras A. So it says the contents. What are they? Well, they begin at the end of Second Chronicles, and they go to Nehemiah. This is not as Ezra, another version. This is another version of all of that. The whole book, the whole Hebrew book of Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, because everything in Chronicles is already stated in Kings. So this is to get you from Kings on. So we don't know that Ezra and Nehemiah didn't take First Esdras and write theirs from that, then put in the story about the walls that doesn't seem to be corroborated in any other book. I mean, Daniel does talk about the walls being built, but it doesn't it doesn't it doesn't have this idea like, oh, we couldn't build the walls, and then like it's all about going back and building the temple. Like, didn't even cross their mind. Like Zerubbabel and all them, they weren't like, oh, if only we had walls. Like, that's just not part of the story. Except in Nehemiah. So to think that you'd have to know Nehemiah to get this idea, and Nehemiah sold in a separate book after Daniel, and that the only way to understand it in this, like, the verse 725 is with this narrative. It's almost like somebody came along later and figured all this out. So it says, Ezra 4:6 includes references to King Ahasuerus. Etymologically is the same as Xerxes, who I disagree, who reigned between blah blah blah. The additional section begins with the story variously as the Darius contest, blah blah blah. It's a kind of interesting story if you wanted to read it, but this section forms the core of First Ezra with Ezra 5, which together are arranged in a literary chiasm around the chiasm. I don't know. Around the celebration of Jerusalem at the exile's return, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with the walls. The chiastic core forms First Ezra to complete literary unit, allowing it to stand independently from the Book of Nehemiah. So it stands independently from the Book of Nehemiah. How do you get your wall doctrine? How do you rightly understand Daniel's prophecy that all these decrees, you know which one it is because it's the one with the walls? When it says the walls are going to be built for the whole 490 years during troubled times. I mean, it's almost like you take Daniel 9:25 and you see a loophole, then you write the whole entire book of Nehemiah based around that. Almost, it's like, because the book for First Esdras, I mean, it goes through all the important parts of Ezra and Nehemiah, except for the wall part, if that's your thing. So most scholars agree that the original language of the work was Aramaic or Hebrew, with a few arguing the originality of Greek. I say Greek. The text contains similarities of the vocabulary in the Book of Daniel and Second Maccabees. Go figure. And it's presumed that the authors came either from Lower Egypt or Palestine, and wrote during the Seleucid period. Well, would you believe that? Oops. Did not mean to do that. Okay, where was I? Josephus makes use of the first Esdras, which he treats as scripture, while generally disregarding the canonical text Ezra and Nehemiah. So the one we have that's canonical, Josephus didn't use that one, but he did use first Esdras, like the apostles. Some scholars believe that the composition is likely to have taken place in the 2nd century BC. Isn't that what the prior sentence said? Pretty much. Many Protestant Catholic scholars assign no historical value to the sections of the book not duplicated. The citations of the other books of the Bible, however, provide an early alternative to the Septuagint for those texts, which increases its value to scholars. In the current Greek text, the book breaks off in the middle of the sentence. That particular verse thus had to be reconstructed from an early Latin translation. However, it is generally presumed that the original work extended to the Feast of Tabernacles as described in Nehemiah 8:13-18. An additional difficulty with the text appears to readers who are unfamiliar with the chiastic structures common in Semitic literature. If the text is assumed to be Western style, purely linear narrative, then Artaxerxes seems to be mentioned before Darius, who was mentioned before Cyrus. Such a jumbling of the order and events, however, is presumed by some readers to exist in the canonical Ezra and Nehemiah. It does. What do you mean? It's presumed by some readers. I mean, it's plain as day. What is it? The Semitic chiasm is corrected in at least one of the manuscripts of Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, Book 11, Chapter 2, where we find the name of the above-mentioned Artaxerxes is called Cambyses. So they're saying the Artaxerxes is a king from not after Darius, but before. Some scholars, including this guy, I forget what this guy says. While others, such as L. Grab, believe it to be independent of the Hebrew language, Ezra Nehemiah. Independent. Independence. You don't need the Ezra Nehemiah to get what you need to know, but somehow you're only going to be able to understand Ezra 7:25, or sorry, Daniel 7:25, with this idea of the wall. If you don't understand the wall from Nehemiah, you can understand Daniel 7:25. All right. Until next time, there's going to be part 3.